Now for part two of our evening. Tonight, I've turned my moderating duties over to one of our talented JSK fellows, Geraldine Moriba. Geraldine is a journalist, filmmaker, and the founder of Moriba Media, her own media firm. She is the executive producer of two major PBS initiatives, Chasing the Dream and Peril and Promise. She is also the director and writer of Until 20, an independent documentary about James Reagan, a young athlete diagnosed with a rare cancer. She has received New York Film Festival Awards, Emmy Awards, and Peabody Awards. And prior to launching her media business, she held a blended role as an executive producer and vice president of inclusion at CNN. The rest of our panel is just as accomplished. Here are some short biographies. Please check Canvas, our online class platform, for more details. To your left, we have Hannah Allam. She's a national reporter for BuzzFeed News, covering U.S. Muslim life. She previously spent a decade as a foreign correspondent with the McClatchy newspaper chain, serving as Baghdad bureau chief during the Iraq War and Cairo bureau chief during the Arab Spring. She has also covered foreign policy and race and demographics. She was part of McClatchy teams that won a Polk Award for Syria reporting and an Overseas Press Club Award for exposing death squads in Iraq. Seated next to Hannah is Hugo Balta. He's a management trainer, talent coach, and president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Previously, Hugo was senior director of multicultural initiatives at the Disney ABC television group, where he led a unit focused on raising the quality, profile, and delivery of diverse news gathering and storytelling. One of his responsibilities was the creation of video and multimedia content targeting the U.S. Hispanic audience across all platforms. Seated to the left of Geraldine, Jenée Desmond-Harris. Jenée is a staff editor for the opinion pages of the New York Times and a graduate of Harvard Law School. She is a 2016 alumna of the JSK Fellowships. Before becoming a fellow, Jenée worked as a staff writer for Vox.com, covering race, law, and politics. Previously, she was an editor at The Root, an African-American news site, where she served as White House correspondent, authored an advice column answering race and culture-related ethics and etiquette questions, and hosted a politics and pop culture podcast. And seated on the end is Bryant Pollard. Bryan is a member of the Cherokee Nation. He served 2 terms as president of the Native American Journalists Association before joining the staff of the organization this summer as director of programs and strategic partnerships. Previously, he served as communications director and AmeriCorps Vista coordinator at the Indigenous Food and Agricultural Initiative at the University of Arkansas. Prior to that, he was executive editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, the tribal news media for the Cherokee Nation, which was first published in 1828. That's your second panel. Geraldine, take it away.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is going to be fun. I have the challenge of topping the first hour, and you guys had the luxury of an entire hour with 2 people. We have 5 of us and 1 hour. So we're going to go rapidly. It'll be rapid fire, and let's begin. Hannah, I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
It's said that journalism happens where fear and courage meet. Let's talk about those 2 words, fear and courage. Is Islamophobia racism?
Rapid fire, right?
Rapid
There's
fire.
no nuance. So is Islamophobia racism? It is such a complex question. It gets right to the heart of language, which is something that I deal with. It's one of the trickiest parts of my beat. Because before we even get to is it racism, what is Islamophobia? And that is something that, that's a debate actually going on among US Muslim communities right now. One camp sort of says, why do we need to call it Islamophobia? We have perfectly good words like bigotry and racism and xenophobia. We already have those names. And also this attachment of phobia, doesn't that sort of underscore that there's something to fear about Islam? And then the other camp says, no, this is a specific systematic discrimination against a group. We name it so we can study it and you can quantify it. And so before we even get to whether it's racism or not, we don't even know, we don't even have a set definition of what Islamophobia is. And so certainly it's a form of hatred. But it also exists sort of parallel to a lot of other forms of hatred. And we know that it's, Muslims in general, it's been said, there's a lot of academic papers you could read about it, about sort of the racialization of Muslims. And that's something that you can see when you have hate crime attacks that target Sikhs or South Asians or Christian Arabs who are not Muslim. So obviously there's a racialized factor, and then of course there's a quarter of all U.S. Muslims, at least I think, is African American. Most of them are homegrown Muslims, not foreign. And so there, I think of the case of Nabra Hassanin, just briefly, a 17-year-old girl killed on her way home from the mosque about 2 Ramadans ago, I think. And that was a case where the community, the greater Muslim sort of community and the activists, that she was targeted because she was Muslim. And her family, who was of Nubian origin, Sudan and Egypt area, said she was targeted because she was black. And so these are really contentious debates, but obviously a form of hatred and exists parallel and is sometimes in tandem with lots of other forms.
Thank you. Hugo, for members of the audience, the Pew Research Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institution that studies media largely. And according to the Pew Research Institute, the top issues for Latinos is not immigration. There's a surprise. It's actually the economy and education. If you watch our news coverage, you would think that that's all Latinos care about. Why do we get it so wrong when we tell stories about Latinos?
Well, I think that that is because newsrooms across the country, and I'm generalizing a bit, but there's stats that support it, are lacking diverse voices. Overwhelmingly, regardless of the platform, the decision makers, both in front of the figurative and literal camera, regardless of platform, are not people of color, are normally the establishment. Usually that is a white, middle-aged male. And so the coverage of the midterm elections is being produced from a point of view that is not of the community. It is the point of view of covering the election of the other. And so whether it's Latino, African Americans, women, etc., it's always very one-dimensional. It is the lowest hanging fruit. Every issue is around immigration or immigration reform because that is the perception of the news gatherers. It's when the news gatherers are members of the community and can produce stories from a perspective of authenticity and authority that you start to peel the onion and have a better understanding of what it is that concerns this community. And then the last thing on that is this notion of the other. When we start to think about who has the right to vote in our country, they're citizens of the United States. And when you start to look at the U.S. Hispanic population, of the nearly 60 million, the largest majority are U.S. born, are citizens of the United States. So while immigration might be relevant because as a second-generation Latino, a son of immigrants, I certainly I was witness to that experience, it is certainly not my immediate issue. And so my issues are the same as all citizens of the United States. It is about the economy. It is about healthcare. It is about crime. And so that is what's at the core for this midterm elections. But again, it's the sophistication of the newsrooms in telling stories from a point of view that is different from their own.
And representation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I also think that is an interesting follow-up to the last question that Richard Louis that you answered, which was the future of our newsrooms. Because while on-air representation tells one story, behind the scenes it's actually another story. And over the past couple of decades, we've seen the numbers of diverse people in our newsrooms decrease. Mm-hmm. So on that note, Jenée. You're a former JSK fellow. Shout out to the fellows. Your research focused, when you were a JSK fellow, on developing a curriculum to teach journalists about unconscious implicit bias. And if anybody in the audience ever wants to test, if you want to test your own bias, there is an online test called the Implicit Bias Association test. It takes a few minutes. It's fascinating and revealing. I won't tell you what it said about me, but it's worth doing. And what you'll find is no matter how many times you take the test, if you're truthful in your responses and you fire rapidly, your answer is always the same. So that's my question. If unconscious bias is that, it's unconscious. We're not consciously doing things. These are unconscious behaviors. How can we change it? And the second part of it is, how does it surface in our reporting?
So when we think of the word bias, especially in a class session that's about bias along with hate and intolerance, we probably think of a really negative word that means maybe we're racist, maybe we're sexist, maybe we don't like people from other parts of the country. My colleague Tanya Mosley and I, as we were researching this, actually found that that kind of bias is not really what's most at play when it comes to the things that get in the way of journalists covering different groups of people appropriately. What actually is going on is something called cognitive bias. And a cognitive bias is an error in thinking that occurs when people are processing information. So every single person who has a brain has cognitive biases. It just means that you're thinking and that you're human, and lo and behold, journalists have brains and are human as well. So it's no surprise that whether or not we harbor animosity toward other groups, or whether we think we're prejudiced against other groups, we still have cognitive biases that affect our reporting. Spoiler alert, we can't get rid of them altogether. And we would have loved to create a workshop where at the end we gave a certificate and said, you no longer have cognitive biases. Instead, we were just able to give people some tools to be more aware of them. I'll just give you a couple of examples of how cognitive biases work. And excuse me if I read from my paper, because some of this is from social science and I'm just a journalist. So one main type of cognitive bias is called a confirmation bias. And that's the tendency to search for or believe information that confirms your pre-existing belief or hypothesis. So has anyone here seen the movie Spotlight?
Yes.
Spotlight's a wonderful example of this because some of the Boston Globe journalists, by their own admission, really believed in the Catholic Church and had a hard time imagining that the priest there could be doing anything so terrible to children. They missed that story for a really long time. And that was an example of confirmation bias getting in the way of their work. Another one is called the availability heuristic. And that's just a mental shortcut that tells you if you're thinking about something, it must be important. A great example of how this affected journalism was, you may remember the Ebola virus panic of 2014. We were all really worried about Ebola, journalists included. Despite the fact that there were only 4 cases in the United States, you saw wall-to-wall coverage of that bias because we all thought if we're thinking about it, it must be important. Another one is called the halo effect. That's a cognitive bias that refers to an observer's overall impression of a person and how that influences the way you think about that person. So an example that we used to illustrate this was the fact that when white women are kidnapped or murdered, studies show they receive much more coverage than when black women or children are kidnapped and murdered. And this is believed to reflect the idea on behalf of many Americans, including those who become journalists, that there is a halo around white women, that they are more innocent and more pure, and that therefore their disappearance or murder is bigger news. So that can creep into our coverage. The bad news, like I said, is that we all have cognitive biases. The good news is that there are some ways not to get rid of them, but to kind of put a check on how they affect our work. Just some quick tools that we came up with for journalists to think about on every story. One, assume that you're not very smart. Question everything you know about what's important, what's urgent, what people care about. Take 1 second to really just question every assumption that you have. Another one is to lean heavily on data and expert opinions instead of these sort of boilerplate languages that we use and just very familiar ideas about different groups that we tend to throw out there again and again. Another one is to have colleagues from different backgrounds check your work, read over it before it's published, and just say, are there any red flags that popped up that might reflect something I'm missing here or a blind spot that could be caused by one of my biases? And the last one was simply to slow down. We read a book about fast thinking and slow thinking. And when you're thinking fast, you're using stereotypes, you're making automatic assumptions, and you're missing a lot. If you can simply slow down, a lot of times you can get in the way of these own biases before they affect your work.
One thing about, and I agree with everything that you said, but I think there's also willful ignorance. I think despite the fact that real educated persons have all of that information and understand how biases work, because 98% of the decision making that we do is unconsciously. This is years and years of evolution. Really, we only use 2% in making decisions where we're thought out. But there is willful ignorance, and even though it's laid out the way you've described it, I'm still going to make a decision based on my gut reaction, or better yet, to control a situation. So I think sometimes I feel that when we talk about unconscious bias, we talk about biases in general, it's a handicap for something that's larger, which is willful ignorance, which is prejudice, which is racism.
Right, and I think that's what Hannah was talking about in your first response. It's about wanting to stay with what's familiar and not becoming exposed to
that's
something.
purposeful.
Yeah,
That's purposeful.
Right, yeah.
That's there is of course a conscious bias where we're all human beings. We want to feel comfortable, and so we gravitate to what's familiar. That is unconscious bias. But there's also the control aspect of maintaining power and maintaining, in most cases, marginalized groups down.
Yeah, there is something called pattern matching in the lexicon of biases as well. And pattern matching is what happens when you hire people you're comfortable with, people who look like you, they go to the same bar, they live in the neighborhood, you maybe share a babysitter, or you worked in the same place before, but you're hiring people you're comfortable with. And what happens when you do that is this, across the newsroom, everybody looks alike, and everybody lives in New York City, everybody lives on the Upper West Side, really.
Right.
It's just the fact.
And it's not just the optics of it, it's about socioeconomic backgrounds, education. So it's not that it's all about race and gender and age, because there's homogeneous leadership could be about where you grew up in which part of the country, where you went to school, and again, your personal wealth. So even they might look different, right? Diversity, they might look different, but then when you start to peel the onion, they're very much alike.
I think it's a good point about willful ignorance, and an interesting thing about this workshop is that when Tanya and I asked to present it to different newsrooms, we always tell the newsroom leaders or the conference leaders that we want this to be a voluntary session, because if you don't want to address your biases, you don't even have hope of having this be effective for you. So the first step is actually, it's one of those things where your intention to fix it is really like 99% of the battle.
And people showed up?
Yeah.
Good.
I can just jump in and talk about the mascot issue. That's one of the things that, an issue that Naja has championed is the eradication of Native imagery in sports mascots and other industries. But we see that at play, where people hang on to those images and they fight changing it, despite the fact that there is mounting evidence at how harmful they are to Native children and just children in general when they see that type of imagery.
So I don't want to leave you out of the conversation, Bryan, because you're on the end. Everybody, just so you know, you have these, what I'm going to show you and explain in an email already. There is these are all tools to help when you're reporting stories related to indigenous people. This one is a chart that says, so you need an indigenous expert, and it's like a flow chart explaining how to find one. There is a style guide with definitions of words, indigenous, tribe, tribal, mascots, treaties, trust, responsibility. And then there's a bingo game. And on the bingo, who likes bingo? On the bingo game, there are words like drugs, casino, something sacred, unemployment, addiction, reservation, singing, poor education, suicide, and it goes on. Let me ask you, Bryan, why is it necessary to provide these tools still?
Yes, that's the question I ask myself all the time. Every time we develop one of these guides, I ask that question. So we developed, the Native American Journalists Association has seen patterns in what we consider to be poor coverage of Native communities. And whenever we pick up on a pattern, several years ago, we decided, let's just develop a guide that we can deploy out into newsrooms that just give people kind of a helpful reminder of some of the things they need to keep in mind when they're covering Native communities. The first one that we did was actually for the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was recently struck down by a district court. But we developed them because I think we see in newsrooms a real blind spot when it comes to Native communities. And so we've developed these, anyone who's familiar with our guides will see that they're kind of a mix. The guide is part nuance that helps people understand Native communities and Native people better so that they know how to approach those communities and how they might be able to get better information from those communities. But another big part of our guides really is just basic journalistic ethics. And I think one of the things that disappoints us many times is that oftentimes the ethical code of conduct that all journalists should be abiding by seems to just be suspended or sometimes abandoned when they're covering Native communities. And so we always include that in our guides, that this is still, even though Native Americans represent a very small portion of the American population, they still are deserving of all of the same journalistic ethics that you would apply covering any other community.
Hannah, the annual FBI hate crimes report showed that the next one's actually coming up in November, very soon. The last one was 2017, and in 2017 it showed an uptick in incidents motivated by bias against Jews, Muslims, and the LGBTQ community, which was higher than the year before, 13% higher, than the election year the year before. What are you predicting we're going to find in the next report? And what do we need to do to start, as journalists, helping to reverse this pattern and these numbers?
Yeah, this next report is due in mid-November, and that one will be really interesting because they're a year behind because of how the data is collected. So this one will be essentially Trump's first year in office. And so there's a lot of interest in what that looks like and was there a spike. But, I mean, I always have to remind people, these are far from perfect numbers. A lot of places don't have hate crime laws, they don't report them, there's wide variations in how they're reported and how officers are trained to report these. So the experts I talk to in an interview whenever the hate crime report comes out caution that it is not a good tool for counting the number of hate crimes. It is a good tool for observing trends and identifying trends and following those. And of course, the sort of attacks on Muslims as well as other religious minorities, but Muslims had the highest leap from year to year. That's something that, yes, we expect to go up. And even knowing that that's a conservative estimate, as far as predictions, I mean, that's not my business. I have to report on sort of the phenomena. I can't make sort of prescriptions on how we can change it. But I do note that one of the most interesting things to come out is, I think is it Brian Levin or Bruce Levin here in California? He runs the Center for Extremism and Studies, and he said that after then President Bush came out and defended Islam, separated Islam, the religion, from the 9/11 attackers, that there was an immediate drop in retaliatory hate crimes against Muslims. So contrast that with the day that then candidate Trump first floated this idea of a Muslim ban, a travel ban. The words he used, I'll never forget it, is precipitous increase. And so, if we are going to start somewhere, I think we'd be foolish not to look at that rhetoric and see some kind of, I think it's too complex to say cause and effect, because there are many other factors. An election year, in general, there's always an uptick. So I think now that we've moved on to that, now we can see what the trends sort of look like under the first year of Trump, with the big caveat that it's an undercount. I hear stories almost weekly on my beat about someone's hijab being yanked off in the grocery line, being told to go home when you're at Burger King ordering food for your kids. Those don't make it into the hate crime report. So yeah, I think that we're probably sadly set to see more of the same.
Okay. Bryan, I'm going to jump to you. Let's talk about the invisibility of Native communities in our national coverage. In 2016 and 2017, Standing Rock forced the national media to finally pay attention to Indian country. It was a top story both years. 2 years later now, most recently, the Standing Rock Sioux Council voted unanimously to support efforts to stop pipelines in Minnesota, Montana, South Dakota, and Louisiana. How many people in the room know that happened? Okay, a handful of people. It didn't make big headlines, and it's actually a big deal. Is there a way to change the invisibility of Native communities in our national coverage?
I think that typically when we're talking to leaders in newsrooms, mainstream newsrooms specifically, we always encourage folks to try to hire Native journalists. But you really just run into a math problem. There's not that many of us. And so that's not really a prescription that is practical in many ways. And so really the main thing that we try to encourage newsrooms to do is to diversify their coverage. We know that when newsrooms dedicate themselves to improving their coverage in Native communities, when they apply resources to it, that they can do better. And we've seen examples of this. High Country News actually is a really good example. They're an environmental news magazine based in Colorado. And they came to me a couple of years ago and they said, you know what, we want to do this really well. We want to cover Native communities. We want three-dimensional contextual storytelling in Native communities. Help us do this. And so we worked with them, Naja worked with them. They set up a desk, an Indian country desk. And they today are, they did what they said they were going to do. They applied resources to it. They were very serious in their commitment to it. And now they are doing some of the best coverage in all of Indian country. It can be done. I think there just has to be a commitment in the leadership of newsrooms that this is a community that they want to cover. They want to cover it contextually and fairly and accurately. And they just need to commit the resources to do it. And hopefully consult with, folks like us at Naja, other Native journalists who are familiar with those communities to set those beats up so that they can do the coverage right. But I think diversifying coverage is possible. There just needs to be a commitment to do it.
Jenée, during the Kavanaugh hearings, Bette Midler tweeted that women are the N-word of the world and that they are the most disrespected creatures on earth. Why did that comparison of the struggle between women and race cause so much controversy? Because I don't think people totally understand. And why does the distinction matter?
Right, so I think that obviously Bette Midler was really frustrated with the way women were being treated and tried to make the most, dramatic comparison that she could think of. That's probably the most generous way of looking at it, right? I think the reason it hit a nerve was that it is almost impossible to make that statement if you remember that some women are also black. So she was sort of revealing that she saw women and black people as two totally separate groups with no overlap. And also possibly the struggles of black people as being like in the past or not of this moment. So I think it hit a nerve on that level. And also because it represented some patterns that people would argue that we see coming from the media. Think about a lot of the stories you see, whether it's about fashion or hairstyles or trends or polling on support for a certain candidate. A lot of times if you look at headlines that say women, and then you go beneath that and look at the statistics, it turns out the story is actually about white women. So the frustration with what she said represented a larger frustration about the fact that sometimes people, even journalists, tend to forget that not all women are white.
Hugo, hello.
Hello.
I'm going to read just a few names.
Sure.
Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Hispanic, Boricua, Garifuna, I can keep going.
Yeah.
These are just a few of the long list of ways that people of who are Latino or Hispanic or Latinx,
Right. Even those two.
define themselves, whether they're from the Americas, the Caribbean, Central America, Mexico. The idea is that each term has a slightly different meaning. Language is powerful and identity is constantly evolving. What does it mean to be Latino, Latina, Latinx today, and how do we know what language to use?
Well, one of the things that you said was interesting. It's how they self-identify. It's not they self-identify. Hispanic is a government-invented word. Latino as well, and sometimes they're used interchangeabody. Hispanic is about language, Latino is about geography. So anybody who speaks, anybody from a Spanish-speaking country is Hispanic. So that includes Spaniards. Everybody who's Latino, the geography, is from Latin America, basically Mexico down. So Brazilians are Latino, but they're not Hispanic. Spaniards are Hispanic, but they're not Latino. Hispanic is the way our government loves to put things into nice, neat boxes. We're on the eve of the U.S. Census, and it's all about self-identification. It's about every 10 years, our country counts us. But Hispanic, if you meet someone who's Hispanic or Latino, like myself, I don't say, hi, my name is Hugo Balta, I'm a Latino, I'm a Hispanic. First thing I'm going to tell you is I'm from Jersey. That's and usually, it gets this reaction. But people say, I'm Peruvian, I'm Cuban, I'm Mexican, Mexican American. They self-describe from either their country of origin or where they can trace their family's roots. And all of them are correct. It's simply put, this is a very diverse group. Yes, some of them have a common language, but even within the language, there are different dialects, different vocabulary. It's like trying to say that even though someone from New York and someone from Missoula, Montana, they're not Americans, or there's a different culture between someone who lives on the West Coast and in the East Coast, but they're all considered Americans. So I think in this group, it's celebrating a common history, and a lot of that has to do with colonialism, of course. Yes, language is how they self-identify, but not only. Language, especially with technology and us continuing to be a global society, language is no longer a barrier. Actually, really, outside of the United States, pretty much every country is multilingual. It is not a luxury, but a necessity in order to communicate, in order to grow your businesses. So in regards to what is right and what is wrong, there is no wrong, there is no right. It's an understanding that even though I am Peruvian American, because of where I trace my roots and my parents being from that country, I am 100% American and 100% Peruvian as far as culture. Language proficiency is important, but not as important as cultural proficiency. And I think once we become more culturally proficient, then we can have true conversations, true communication.
Bryan, what if I threw the same answer to you and asked about how to identify people from various indigenous communities in America?
I think that one of the things that we are constantly cautioning our colleagues in media against is just using the term Native American. It's used ad nauseum. When you're describing, all of the, pan-Indian peoples of North America, you can use that term. But really, you need to keep in mind that there are almost 600 distinct cultural peoples that inhabited this continent prior to its colonization. And so we encourage media to identify people by those cultures. And so they would identify me as a Cherokee rather than identifying me as a Native American.
So be more specific.
Yes, identify them specifically to the culture that they belong to.
So I'm going to ask a couple of questions that are general, and any of you can jump in, because I think there are so many issues that apply to all of us. With the increasing way we consume news, it's very personalized, whether we get it through social media or we go to our favorite websites or favorite cable station. If we are now consuming increasingly in silos, information silos, how do we build bridges in our increasingly divided world? And how do we share stories that touch more people if people are sort of turning inwards?
Can I, this is, and I know this, I feel like embarrassed to say because it's almost like a luxury now to get to go to travel to so many places have been cut. I worked at McClatchy for many, many years, and I saw, the chipping away of resources at a newspaper chain that serves so many communities around the country. So I know that what I'm about to say is a luxury, but I did this past summer, I'm from Oklahoma, and I decided I wanted to get out of the DC echo chamber, and I really wanted to go back home. So I took my son, we moved home to my mom's, and I reported throughout the South, Texas, Georgia, Oklahoma, and other places. And I mean, it was just refreshing. I mean, as painful as some of the moments were to witness and some of the things to hear, I mean, walking into an Oklahoma cafe where I was gonna, write for the day, and I asked for the Wi-Fi code, and she said, yes, it's media plague, no space. Like, oh, okay, nice to feel welcome. But it's, to see those things, I mean, up close, to see how Russia was not registering, how that's not what everybody was talking about down there, how they were trying to get rent together for the month, how they were, turning the urgent care into their primary care. I mean, those were the things that I took away from that whole experience. And yes, I did hear horrendous views about Muslims. And to know, I guess it's just to really know what's out there. So you can, and it's part of the exercise, though, that makes a beat like mine and all of ours really difficult, because when you have to spend so much time myth busting before you can even get to the news, there's an opportunity cost to that. There's stories that you don't get to because first I have to say, I have to poke at the fact, no, Muslim teens are not disappearing in the night from their bedrooms and going en masse to ISIS. Around 250 total, the FBI said, tried to go or made it. And so that gets to the willful blindness thing you brought up. That's 0.0075% of the US Muslim population, but this was portrayed and hyped as this really, really big threat. And so I think what Bryan was saying earlier about like the suspension of ethics, I don't think we need to write new rules necessarily, but to apply them equally. And so I don't know, getting out of those activist circles, I think really did help me and make me think about who is the audience, what stories am I telling, what are themes that are universal that could even maybe penetrate that willful blindness and make people see the people that I write about as human.
And I think that's key, universal. I think we need to be better storytellers. I thought the part of the conversation about objectivity and fairness and accuracy was really interesting. We're human beings, we're not objective. And journalists are trained to stay on the sidelines as if we are in a pedestal or we're above what happens. But many journalists are members of the community and they're telling stories that also affect them. Universal is very important. One of the most popular stories this year around immigration reform was the separation of families at the border. That was the first time in the 2 years since Donald Trump won the election that it actually brought people together. People can disagree about immigration reform, but people can agree you don't separate a toddler from their mother. You don't separate children from their parents. And then, if you're going to separate them, you don't separate them without a way to bring them back together. I went on a cruise with my family, and as soon as we were separated, we had bracelets. I knew how to get back to my son and my daughter. How could it be something as simplistic that is given when you go on a cruise could not be applied by the government? So it's about telling stories that, yes, have a very specific nucleus about undocumented immigrants crossing the border. But when you start to make it universal, when you start talking about who we are as human beings, parents and children, that's when we're making connections. That's when we're actually having conversations that in a span of less than a week, a strong rhetoric of zero tolerance went from, no, we got to bring them back together. And that we don't do enough of that. As journalists, we don't do enough of that.
I know we talk a lot about getting people out of their silos and how we tend to get more and more news that we agree with because of algorithms and the way our news feeds and our networks are set up. If I could change one thing about the way people consume media, it actually would not be to get people out of their silos, it would just be to teach media literacy. I've learned that a lot of people don't know the difference between news and opinion, or don't recognize legitimate reporting versus blogging. I think it would be so valuable if we taught people tools to understand what they're reading and how serious it is and how real it is. If someone reads one of Hannah's pieces at BuzzFeed about hate crimes against Muslims, I don't think anyone's helped by them then going to Fox News and reading the Muslims are terrible. That's out of their silo, that's balanced, but I don't think that creates a smarter person or a better world. I would rather have them look at everything they read and weigh it according to who wrote it, what it's based on, what the publication is, and whether it's based in fact or opinion.
I think what we try to encourage when reporting on Native communities is reporting on the humanity of Native people. Because the stereotypes are so persistent in society. Feathers and teepees and powwows and all that stuff. These are the images that come to mind when you think about Native people and Native communities. But those of us who work and live within Indian country understand that we are people who are members of this greater American experiment. And we're trying to feed our kids and care for our elders and make our neighborhoods and our communities a better place. And we don't see enough of that kind of reporting in Native communities. In fact, we see very little of it. And so I think that whether you're talking about Native communities or really any community of color or any community, we need more stories just about, to Hugo's point, about the humanity that we all share, and I think that would go a long way.
So, okay, I got my signal. I'll save. I have a question, but I'll save it.
That's quite a stack.
Yeah. Okay.
Next.
That sounds like it's for me. That sounds like it's for me.
This one is for you. So this is, don't op-ed pages, opinion pages simply exacerbate cognitive biases? Couldn't we more effectively burst our filter bubbles by curbing our consumption of op-eds?
I know there's a lot of criticism of op-ed pages, some of them fair. I don't think they exacerbate cognitive biases because those are just based on the way that our brains work, and reading something isn't really going to change that one way or another. Maybe what the person is saying, do they make our opinions more entrenched if we read something that we agree with? Mm-hmm. I think a solution is not to have people stop expressing their opinions and putting that in the newspaper. After all, we live in the age of social media, and if we don't provide an edited and fact-checked op-ed on the news of the day, someone's going to go to Twitter and just read someone's thoughts off the top of their head. I think a better solution is providing op-eds from a wider range of voices, including those that aren't heard as much. The two types of op-eds that I think are most effective and most important for, frankly, our democracy are not just someone's musings off the top of their head, but rather op-eds by people who have actual expertise and have dedicated all or part of their career to studying an issue and have data and facts and analysis to back up what they're saying, and two, pieces by people who are actually personally affected, not just that they watch the news on it, but they're materially affected in their day-to-day lives by whatever the news of the day is. So, for example, I edited an op-ed by a woman who was in one of the family detention centers that's been set up with her young child. When we learned that they were going to be switching the children from the children's centers to the family centers, she wrote, "Guess what, I was in one of those, actually several years ago. It was really terrible. Here's how we were treated. Here's everything that happened." That was based in fact. It was an opinion piece, but it was based in her personal experience. And no, I don't think that someone would be harmed by reading that.
But I also think this is a business, right? And that's part of the problem, because it's all about impressions. It's all about ratings. Why Native Americans are not getting the coverage that they deserve is because, unfortunately, around a decision-making table, people that are choosing which stories to cover, they're saying this is not selling. Why are we, I can turn on any cable news for any period of time, and I'm just going to be bombarded with Donald Trump, Donald Trump, Donald Trump, Donald Trump. Why? Because people are consuming that content, because the ratings are up. Local news gets dinged for if it bleeds, it leads. There's so much crime. But you know what? We're turning on the local news for it. So until we start to manage ourselves better, that's still going to be a problem. I think some of the best journalism that I've seen is being done by not-for-profits and smaller community-oriented news, because they're covering stories that the larger media companies aren't, because they're very focused on the business part of media and not about the community themselves.
I always tell people I get to write a specialized beat and do things like go to Oklahoma for the summer because enough people click on cat quizzes. So I always tell people come to BuzzFeed for the cat gifts, stay for the investigative journalism.
That's a great
line.
That's great marketing.
Bryan, there are 3 questions here for you, and they're all really similar. They're the same question.
Okay.
And everybody seems to want to know your opinion about Elizabeth Warren and her DNA.
Didn't see this coming. Yeah. So, full disclosure, I'm Cherokee. I had relatives that came across the trail during Indian removal, and so I do have some of my, let's just say, my own perspective on this. I guess what I'll say in general, and setting Senator Warren aside, because, for the most part, I agree with her politics, but I think that she really did a disservice to Indian country with this particular political stunt. That type of quantifying of Native identity, whether it's through blood quantum, which is a measurement imposed by the federal government, or DNA testing, is a diminishing of Native people. It's a way of vanishing Native people. It's a way of picking apart their identity and dissecting it so that they can be deconstructed and destroyed. And I think if we're going to honor the indigenous people of this continent, we need to recognize their sovereign ability to determine who they are and who belongs in their community, and recognize that, and recognize the methods that they want to choose to do that. And I can tell you that it's not DNA testing. And so I think that she, I don't know what she was thinking, frankly, but because I think that she has really tried to cast herself, ever since this controversy kind of bubbled up, she's really tried to cast herself as an ally to Native people. But I think she really misstepped in this instance.
Here's a question. If, in fact, diversity is going down in newsrooms, in broadcast journalism, is it because there are less qualified people, or is it prejudice?
It's prejudice. Of course it's prejudice. To think that there aren't qualified people, whether they're women, or whether it's gender, race, ethnicity, or age, is preposterous. Not qualified people. As the president of one of many affinity journalism groups, one of the things that we struggle continuously is hearing from media managers that say, we just can't find them.
Anybody qualified. We can't find them. They're not out there.
And then I'd say to them, well, we have 2,300 qualified candidates. It's just that you're not.
And that's just one group.
And that's just one group. That you're not being inclusive. It goes back to bias. It goes back to willful ignorance. It is prejudice. It is racism. It is a systematic way to control people. I mean, one of the you mentioned about how Native Americans are being portrayed. One of the things that I knew growing up, they were portrayed as the enemy. They were the bad guys. I remember playing with my set. The good guys were the
Cowboys.
The cowboys, and the bad guys were the Indians. And if I apply it to my community, over the last 60 years, they're caricatures of what a Latino is. If you're, and it's microaggressions, right? And some microaggressions can be funny. It's the typical, if you're Latino, you're Mexican, you have a mustache, you're hot-tempered, you must love soccer. Those microaggressions are the things that chip away at our identities and make caricatures of our communities to people that are not members of the community, and so much so that those stereotypes then become their reality of who they are. That part of the problem is we're not telling our own stories. Others are telling our stories, and they're dictating the narrative of who our communities are.
Well, that coupled with the fact, am I allowed to give my opinion as the moderator? With the fact that the same systems of inequity that exist in every system in this country exist in our newsrooms. There are very systematic ways that people are squeezed out. And I'm sure we all have stories. But I'm going to use moderator privilege to ask the last question. And because we have just a few minutes, and I know we're running out of time. There's a professor on campus, Fukuyama. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. He's pretty well known. He wrote a book recently. It's called The Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment. And in his book, he really focuses on dignity as being a unifying factor for this country and for the future of the globe. And it's a good read. You should all read it. I recommend it. And he specifically talks about the last election and white voters and the fact that across all lines, whether it's gender or socioeconomic, it's contrary to the myth that it was just the flyover states, white people in the middle of the country that voted for Trump. There were a lot of white people out in New York, where I live, that voted for Trump across the country. Fukuyama's argument is that it was about dignity and a sense of a loss of dignity. So the question that I have for you guys is whether or not identity politics and the way that we may or may not be dividing ourselves, is identity politics undermining democracy? I know you guys didn't see that one coming.
Well, I mean, if it didn't work for that group in question to begin with, I mean, to them, where can they go but up? You know, if it wasn't working, if you can build houses of worship except mosques, if everyone can come to the country except Muslims, I mean, they're not so tiny. There's tiny and there's not so tiny indignities that I will tell you, when I covered the Arab Spring rebellions, that started with a fruit vendor, you know, in Tunisia, a sidewalk vendor who was just tired of all those indignities. And, you know, when I would go to Tahrir Square, it wasn't the big, you know, equivalent of what would be, you know, the Russia investigation. It wasn't a massive corruption scandal that brought people there. It was the shakedowns from the beat cops every day. It was, you know, the demands for bribes at every level of government. It was, you know, being told, you can't stand here, you can't protest, you can't vote, you can't do this. It was all those indignities that boiled over. And sometimes I talk to my old, you know, colleagues who were more specialized in, you know, sort of conflict resolution studies and things like that, and they're alarmed at what they see here with some of that sort of tribalism and the factions, but also there are collective demands that these groups are making that I think a lot of people would say are long overdue.
So maybe the question's wrong. It's not, is identity politics undermining democracy? Maybe the question is, isn't democracy about identity politics? Any last thoughts that anybody wants to share before we say goodnight?
I think that last question sounds like an entire class. So
Yes.
I'll just leave it at what you said.
Okay. All right. Well, then, in that case, thank you all. And
Thank you.